my point was, at a moment like this, I think it's useful for us to talk to someone with perspective. There is nobody in the city of Portland who I think has more perspective about race relations than you. Before we got on the phone, I was reviewing a story that Willamette Week wrote in 1981 about the Burger Barn. It was when I was a Cub reporter at Willamette Week, and I don't know, you were a Cub black activist. Burger Barn, for those who don't have the history, was a black-owned soul food restaurant that one night had something like 5 dead possums tossed on its front stoop. Later determined that it was the work of 8 police officers. Mm-hmm. You were out front then, as you are now. If I recall correctly, because of that incident and because of your protestations, the first police oversight committee was created.
Yes.
So take us back. What, if anything, has changed in Portland since 1981?
Gentrification, for one. I think there is an acknowledgement that there has to be some form of police oversight. That's no longer a debate. Back then, there was a debate. That's no longer a debate. Since then, you've had a number of black officers hired. At that point in time, there were very few. And since that time, I think we now have our 4th black police chief. So obviously, there have been some changes in, at least structurally, in how law enforcement is supposed to be monitored and its hiring practices. In terms of day-to-day practices, there still needs to be a lot of work done there. Outside of law enforcement, you've had, at that point in time, you had Charles Jordan, who was a city commissioner, and then Dick Bogle, and now Joanne Hardesty. So there seems to have been an acceptance that there should be black representation on the city council, as well as the county commission. You've had Loretta Smith was a county commissioner. So in terms of the political system saying, yes, we'll have a bit of inclusion, that's occurred. In terms of life for the average black person, it's probably, in terms of wealth, it hasn't moved. Unemployment, same. Healthcare, not that great. If you look at infant mortality rates, probably still the same, twice as high as white mothers. So the way in which you measure progress for the average black citizen, there's been very, very little change, very little change. And probably the worst example is gentrification, when redlining was used to disperse the black population all over the city. The kind of financial instruments that were made available by banks to white citizens to purchase own homes were never made available to black citizens. And I think most people by now know that for the majority of white citizens in this country, their wealth was obtained through home ownership. That's what created the white middle class in America. Those same instruments, in most cases, were forbidden to be given to black citizens. So I think today, and Portland is no exception, the average black citizen has 1/10 the wealth of the average white citizen. So if you take a look at life for the average black person in Portland, very little has changed.
So given that, Ron, it does strike me that this country's at an inflection point. These protests are unrelenting and historic. Portland now has a black police chief, happened overnight. There are calls to defund police, which I want to ask you about a little bit more. There's a bill in Congress that the Democrats have pushed forward to sort of federalize and create some national standards about use of force. my long question is, what seems to have changed? There has been no shortage of data to show that if you're a black man in this country, you're what, 3 times more likely to get killed by a cop than if you're white. I mean, there's no lack of data. Portland itself has had a number of terrible examples, all of which you have been centrally involved in protesting. 4 years after the Burger Barn, Lloyd Stevenson, an African-American security guard, was killed by a cop when he was actually being a good Samaritan. You were there. Obviously, there are national examples of Black lives that have mattered and have perished. And yet, with this one death of a man in Minneapolis, it feels like, it does feel like a turning point. And I'm wondering what you think is different this time around.
There's an old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Most Americans have never watched a human being slowly murdered by a police officer. Most Americans have never seen that. They've heard stories about it. They've read news accounts about it. But to watch a human being slowly being murdered, even crying out for help, that's something most Americans have never seen. And I think they were extraordinarily shocked by that, into the realization that this is only one example of the stories that they have heard. But again, a picture, especially in a society in which people spend so much time on screens, to see that in front of their very own eyes. There's no debate now about probable cause, trying to inflict harm on a police officer. There's no debate. And I think it shocked people out of most white Americans out of their naivete when it comes to police violence that is directed at the Black community.